So what do you do when you don't have the budget to make movies anymore, but you still want to keep a franchise going? Well, you make a forgettable TV show, of course.
Those were apes, weren't they? Gorillas. What kind of planet is this?
For those of you that don't know, 1974's Planet of the Apes is a live-action TV show that lasted 14 episodes, which I know these days is like 3 seasons, but in the 70s that was less than a season. It tells the story of 2 astronauts, Peter Burke and Alan Verdon, from the 1980s who land in the 3080s where apes have taken over and humans, who can still talk, are mostly slaves or servants. They subsequently become enemies of the state for having dangerous ideas like the truth about Earth's past and humans not being the lower species. Pete and Alan are also joined by a chimpanzee named Galen, which marks the 3rd ape Roddy McDowall has played in this franchise, who was on the run for realizing the astronauts are right and also killing a fellow ape. Most of the episodes involve the gang dealing with the consequences of being criminals, whether that being shot or captured or just trying to hide in some way or another, and often they go out of their way to help humans or even apes. I would not call this a bad show. I enjoy the characters, and it can be pretty funny and interesting at times, but it's mostly just kind of there, which makes it hard to recommend to anyone who isn't completely obsessed with Planet of the Apes as a franchise. I don't think I like this show, but I'm not sure if I could explain why that is either, except for maybe this. When I first saw this show, I had just finished watching all 9 Planet of the Apes that were out at the time, and then I tried watching this show in a short period of time, and this is very much a weekly show. Though I do have one major complaint. This show feels very aimless. The reason for that is Pete and Alan have a goal, and they make an actual effort to achieve this goal twice in the entire series. Pete and Alan want to go home. It's a goal that's established in the first episode, which also establishes a few plot devices that could have been used. One is the magnetic disc from their spaceship that recorded everything that happened to the ship, and might have information that would help them try to get to their time, if only they could figure out a way to read it. The pair almost get themselves killed trying to get this disc, and them almost losing it is the reason the entire second episode happens. And then it never shows up again. The only other time they try to get back home is in the 5th episode, The Legacy. Here, the gang finds a hologram recording of a man from the Oakland Science Institute. Apparently, at some point far in the past, the OSI had realized that the world was about to end and decided they needed to consolidate what they considered to be all the world's knowledge and store it in vaults in cities all across the world. Why they decided that the best place to store this information would be in cities, the places most likely to be destroyed in a world-destroying war, which is most likely what happened here, is beyond me, but fine. In a separate area of the city, they leave a hologram that tells you where it is, and the trio finds this hologram device, but of course the episode would end if it was that simple, so of course the gang has to deal with repowering the device and Alan getting captured, which takes up most of the episode. Because Alan gets captured, he accidentally reveals the location of the hologram, which allows the apes to find out where the collection of all human knowledge is, destroying it before anyone can do anything with it. Now, of course, the way this collection seems to work is just by printing a bunch of sheets of paper, so that would have been a pain to sort through to actually try to get any information out of it, and it wasn't like there was much hope for Pete and Alan, but this episode does mostly end up being a waste of time. And those episodes are all we get. There's a few mentions of wanting to go home beyond that, but there's no actual other efforts. Now, in a way this makes sense, because this show is episodic, which means beyond the pilot, there is extremely little continuity between episodes. So, just like The Legacy, every episode that has Pete try and go home would end in failure, which I feel like would get rather annoying after a while. That, and the fact that if Pete and Alan actually managed to get home, they'd most likely be leaving Galen alone as a criminal in the 3080s, generally makes the gang trying to get back home to their time a bad premise to start with, which is probably why it's abandoned most of the time. But I wonder if it could have been more interesting if the show had instead dealt with Pete and Alan coming to terms with the fact that they'd never make it home. So, alright, Fine, one of the premises of the show is a wash, but at least we have a much more prominent premise of the trio being criminals. And indeed, 13 out of the 14 episodes involve the gang either avoiding capture or getting captured and escaping. Though admittedly, 3 of those 13 aren't actually because they're criminals, it's just them getting captured for completely separate reasons, which kind of gives you an idea of how dangerous this world is for random humans. Speaking of this world, let's talk about lore. I don't know what the official stance is, but I consider this show to be in a completely separate continuity from everything else, which means instead of doing a separate video about the lore, we're just gonna do it here. And I'll explain why I don't think this is part of the original movie continuity as we go. Sometime before 1985, an oil tycoon wanted to live like a 16th century baron, so he built a castle near San Francisco. This isn't really relevant to anything, but I do think it's funny. In 1985, 3 astronauts, Peter Burke, Alan Verdon, and Jonesy, I bet you can guess what happens to him, considering I haven't mentioned him yet, run into radioactive turbulence on the way to Alpha Centauri. Jonesy activates an automatic homing device, and somehow they go through what Pete and Alan assume to be some kind of time warp. Because I guess ominous time warps dot space like a minefield in this franchise. We see this in the intro to each episode, though interestingly nowhere else. It's possible that the radioactive turbulence was the time warp, but we never get any confirmation on anything. At some time between the beginning of space travel and the end of the world, a second group of astronauts also disappear into a time warp. Considering when Pete and Alan learn of this group, they don't realize, oh, it's probably that other group that disappeared. I'm going to assume those astronauts disappeared after them. More than 500 years pass, and during that time, or I guess potentially a little before 1985, humanity learns how to make holograms, pills that have all your nutrients so you don't need to bother eating real food, disposable clothing that you wear and then wash down the drain, I don't know why, and nuclear-powered subways. At some point after 2503, we see a textbook with New York in the year 2503 still very much standing. The world ends, and apes take over as the dominant species. What this means is that this can't be the same timeline as the original movie, because that says there were 2,000 years between 3976 and apes taking over the world. And considering the world has to end long enough after 2503 for a textbook to feel the need to have a picture of New York in that year, there's not enough time for you to even estimate 2,000 years. We have no idea how the world ended, but we can presumably assume it had something to do with a huge war, especially considering the war bunker in the western US that is
Maybe a couple 100 years old.
We do know 2 things about it. One, it was known a bit before the world ended that it would, giving time for the OSI to collect the knowledge of all humanity and send it to cities across the world. 2, it was not the same thing that happened in Conquest, where apes became the replacement for cats and dogs after all the furry pets died, because we see 2 dogs in this show, which is 2 more than there should be if all cats and dogs died. In the presumably hundreds of years after apes took over, history, while not completely forgotten, is very much twisted. Apes know there was an advanced society before them and even call them the ancestors, but considering there's still ruins of cities everywhere and even surviving books, this is kind of inevitable. However, they seem to think that it was apes that did it all. Now, I find this fascinating. Consider the original 1968 movie. In that, apes didn't know humans were advanced before them, but more so, they didn't realize that there had been any society before them. And while everyone thinks humans are violent and evil, the reason the Dr. Zaius of that movie knows for a fact that they're very dangerous and violent is because he knows there was an advanced human society before that blew themselves up. But the apes here know there was something before them, and at least the higher-ups have books from that time, and even some of those people believe it was an ape society before them. Which leaves 2 questions. 1, what do they think happened to their ancestors? And 2, how is Counselor Zaius, the leader of the area and seemingly the only one who knows that humans were first, managed to hide the fact that they were humans? Question 1 can be answered pretty easily. They probably still think there was a huge war that destroyed everything. The apes of this show have a lot less reverence for simians than those of the original series. Corruption runs rampant, even the good apes are racist against other apes, though admittedly that also happened in the original series, and even the sacred law of the original series, ape must not kill ape, is nowhere to be seen. Sure, murder is generally bad, but it's considered way less bad than heresy, and Urko, the military leader trying to capture the gang, has no qualms about killing Galen. So the idea of an ape war destroying everything doesn't really seem all that ridiculous as it would be in the original movie. Not that the original apes were actually good, but they thought they were. We also know that apes don't exactly have the highest opinion of their ancestors. In the second episode, an ape named Barlow finds a golf club, and while he realizes the metalwork was very good, he also thinks it's a weapon and thinks the ancestors were stupid to think that would be a good weapon. The second question is a little harder to deal with. There's enough of the remnants of old society that you would think some of it would show humans being the dominant species, not apes. Like, I don't know, a statue of a human that everyone seems to be ignoring. An ape wouldn't make that. There's even an episode where Pete and Urko see an ad for a zoo with apes in it hidden in some ruins. But this is the first time Urko even considers the idea that humans were advanced first. But the most damning evidence would have been the books. Most apes don't find old books, but there's still quite a few from the past around, and members of the government that don't seem to know humans were first study them a lot. Just based on the writings and pictures in those textbooks, you would assume some hints that they were written by humans. But the idea is just never brought up. It seems as though at least educated apes are just willfully ignorant, because if they thought about it at all, they would figure it out pretty quickly. Back to things we do know, barely. From 1985 to 3080, Earth became a lot warmer, or something else happened to make the tropics move into North America, as not only are there new tropical fruit species that are in what we would think of as Central California, but a species like the version of a cinchona, a tree currently native to South America, seems to have moved all the way up to California too. In around the year 3070, the second group of astronauts landed on Earth. We don't know much about them because Urko killed them before the show even starts, but we know they brought rather fancy looking grenades and snuck into Central City, the capital of the area. Pete and Alan did not bring grenades, which makes sense because those are a pretty weird thing to bring into space, which probably means that whatever mission this other crew was originally on, they expected danger. And I am fascinated by the implications of this. Sure, astronauts do bring weapons for if they land in a dangerous place, but grenades feel like a bad option for that. So, based on almost nothing, I think these astronauts were sent through the time warp to find Pete and Alan, but missed the mark. Speaking of, Pete and Alan land 10 years later, with Jonesy dying on landing, or possibly before, because that's an important thing to happen every time a spaceship lands on the planet of the apes. They find a society that has lost a lot of knowledge, and thus don't know about things like photos and compasses, and while it technically has a central government, it is a lot more tribal than its government would probably like to believe. A lot of areas, especially in what seems to be the outskirts, are just kind of doing whatever, though that mostly involves using the gods, which sometimes is just a vague collection that doesn't like it when you travel at night when you can't see the stars, and sometimes is literally just sharks to exploit humans, including kidnapping any humans that seem to be wandering and making them slaves. Which is interesting, because the towns with a little more society just use societal structures to exploit humans. I think it's a pretty interesting world, and in a show that actually cared to follow through with anything they set up, it would have been a pretty good watch. In its current state, it's some interesting backdressing for a show that is not, which could also be how you describe the characters. We'll start with Pete, who is probably the least fleshed out, but still has enough going on to contrast well with Alan and Galen. He's generally an extremely pessimistic and sarcastic man, but that doesn't mean he isn't willing to help someone, especially when it comes to hitting someone else. He's also the ladies' man, or so he says. The man may make jokes like,
"Just watch the heifers around the one named Burke."
And,
You see, if you lose one home, you try to find another one. Preferably among friendly natives who are about, so tall and round in the right places.
but his bouts with women in this show leave a bit to be desired. He only actually flirts with a woman once in episode 13, The Liberator, where in an unprecedented move, the gang gets captured by humans instead of apes, and Pete tries to flirt with one of his captors to get some help. And it goes like this.
You know, where I come from, mothers used to warn their daughters about me, but you've really raised caution to new heights. Oh, I could give you a demonstration right now, but you see, I'm a little tied up. You gonna be the one who brings our food every day?
Yes, I am.
Like tonight, maybe?
Yes.
There's gonna be a full moon tonight.
Yes, there is.
What does a full moon and a soft breeze and maybe a dozen long-stemmed red roses do for you? Huh?
Which I think leaves both me and him wondering how he ever got a woman ever. Luckily, Pete has an excuse for why it didn't work this time, because it turns out the girl he's trying to flirt with is engaged, but that doesn't stop Alan from making fun of him for it. And good thing, too. Pete's second encounter with what could almost be considered romance, we're going backward in time here, but this is still the second encounter, is mostly a hallucination. See, in episode 10, The Interrogation, Pete gets captured and is interrogated by a chimpanzee named Wanda. Wanda is pretty bad at interrogating, partially because she just refuses to believe that there would be any apes that helped Pete and Alan besides Galen. Her final idea to get any information is to completely disorient him by spinning him around in circles for a very long time while loud noises play, and then flirting with him. Okay, in her defense, she does have a reason for doing this. She's taking these ideas from a book about interrogation written in the 1980s, and this book tells her that if someone is sufficiently disoriented, they might relate a gentle touch and kind voice to someone they have loved in their past. And indeed, that's exactly what happens. Pete ends up hallucinating a scene with some woman, presumably from his past. Now, we don't know how much of this hallucination is how he would act around this woman, and how much is a part of him still hiding information about his interrogator, but if it is accurate, this is the best we get in terms of a backstory for Pete. He had someone he seemed to love, but was just so closed off from her. We don't know if she broke up with him because of it, or if he went to space, never to see her again, but that's all we get, because just when Wanda might actually get some information, she tries to kiss him, and through the haze, Pete sees this, and is so disgusted he snaps out of his hallucination. I have no clue why she thought that would work, but she decides she's tried everything and gives up after that. I think she's embarrassed that she tried to kiss a human. I would be too if I was an ape. He only has one bout with romance as anything close to successful with someone that actually says she loves him. The problem is that it's an ape that doesn't realize he's human because she's blind. You know, I said this show was boring, but the more I describe it, the more I realize my perception of boring might be a bit skewed. I'm actually going to talk about this entire episode because despite the fact that I hate it for obvious reasons, it is pretty interesting. Like they often do, the trio start the episode in someone's home. But in this town, there's what they call the Dragoons, but what is simply a lynch mob. So their host gets killed, and the gang decides they need to do something about the lynch mob. The reason the Dragoons exist at all, or at least the excuse they give, is that two humans killed an ape named Lucian, the father of Fauna, the blind ape. A lot of apes don't think humans will ever give up the murderer, and technically they're right, but only because a human didn't do it. So they decide that all humans need to be punished. So they do things like burn down houses and kill random humans. Now, of course, the twist is that the leader of the lynch mob is the guy that actually killed Fauna's father, but it takes the entire episode to find that out. The gang decides to not only get the lynch mob arrested, but also find out who murdered Fauna's father. And to do that second part, they talk to her. And Galen, after realizing that Fonda hates humans because she thinks they killed her father and is blind, decides to introduce Pete and Alan as apes. They somehow manage to avoid anyone else being around every time they talk to her, or this terrible charade would have ended a lot sooner, but as is, it lasts a few days, which is apparently long enough for Fauna to think she's in love with Pete. Now, in her defense, she does have some reasons. They aren't good reasons, obviously, but they are reasons. First, Pete is good at telling stories, like the story of Robinson Crusoe, and since Fauna is blind, she can't read anymore, which she used to love to do. But her father used to read to her, so I guess Pete telling her stories reminds her of him. I'll accept that one. 2, she thinks Pete has Galen's face. There's a moment when Fauna wants to feel just Pete's face because she already likes him at this point, and since obviously Pete doesn't have an ape face, they shove Galen's face in front of her instead. And I guess Galen is a handsome ape. This one is bad, but it's not her fault. 3, Pete's voice reminds her of her childhood friend and potentially ex who stopped talking to her when she went blind. And it's only after she realizes who Pete's voice reminds her of that she decides she's in love with him. Girl, you are not over your ex and he sucked. So she tells Galen, who tries to convince her that she's being stupid and that she probably shouldn't trust Pete without revealing that Pete is actually a human, which doesn't work. So Galen yells at Pete, even though literally none of this is his fault, and he's not the one who decided to pretend that Pete and Alan were apes, Galen. But fine. Pete decides to talk to her to see what he can do, and after that doesn't work, he instead tries to use the story of Jacob and Esau from the Bible as a metaphor for what's happening. Now, for those of you that don't know that story, you might be confused, but don't worry, me explaining it won't help much. Pete tells an extremely abridged version, but because I think this story is really funny, I'm going to explain it a bit more. See, Jacob and Esau were twins, and while Esau was older, Jacob was born with his hand around Esau's ankle, which is why he was named Jacob, because it means something along the lines of one at the heel, or more metaphorically, deceiver. Esau's name just means hairy, because he was extremely hairy. Now, because Esau was the oldest, he would get stuff like the bigger inheritance and their father Isaac's blessing, which was a super important thing to have at that time. But Jacob, being a little brat, decided, with a little pushing from his mother Rebecca, that he wanted all that. The inheritance was relatively easy. Jacob was a good cook, and after making some soup, Esau comes in from a long hunting trip and is very hungry. He asks for the soup, and Jacob goes, "Alright, give me your inheritance for the soup." And Esau agrees to it. This has nothing to do with what Pete is telling Fauna, but it's still ridiculous, so I had to bring it up. The part that is actually relevant, and the main thing that Pete tells Fauna, is that to get the blessing of the aging and almost blind Isaac, Jacob pretended to be Esau. And the way he did this was by wearing Esau's clothes, and, because Jacob was less hairy than Esau, putting goat skin on his hands and pretending that was his actual skin. Now, Isaac almost sees through this disguise because he recognizes Jacob's voice, but what convinces him is the goat skin, which means Esau's skin is comparable to goats. Now, admittedly, I don't know a lot about goats, but that's insane, right? Now, obviously, Esau and Isaac find out, so Jacob has to run away, but by that point it's too late and the damage is done. So Pete tells this story, but in his version of the story, he says Jacob had to trick Isaac, and he did it out of desperation, which simply isn't true. At best, you could say his mother forced him to do it because it was her idea, but he didn't need to do anything. He was just greedy. Not that it matters. Fauna hears this story of a smooth-skinned man tricking a blind person by having them feel something that wasn't actually them, and this goes completely over her head. And she just goes,
"I have touched your face. It is strong like Esau's. If it was soft and smooth like Jacob's, I should fear and despise you."
Listen, I understand that she's blind. She literally doesn't see the very obvious metaphor, but also now 2 people have told her Pete is not to be trusted, including Pete himself, and she does not care. So Pete does the only thing left to him. He tells her the truth. No, not that he's human, that would be ridiculous. Instead, he tells Fauna that he and his friends are leaving and she'll never see him again, so she better get over it. Which maybe wasn't the best thing to say, but I don't think it was a bad thing to say either. Fauna, of course, doesn't take this well, and while taking a walk along the cliff, which she seems to enjoy doing, she falls into the water. Now, I don't think this was intentional on her part, but you never know, and either way, it means that Pete and Alan have to save her, because apes in this world can't swim and are actually terrified of water. And finally, Fauna finds out that the love of her life is actually a human, and of course is devastated. And finally, as her uncle Cestus tries to explain to her that humans aren't actually bad, because this one saved her life, he explains to her that the leader of the lynch mob, Zon, killed her father, not some humans, and that Cestus was there to see it happen. This causes the entire lynch mob to disband as they realize they were being led by a liar, and because he was doing a lot of threatening people with a gun at this point, which probably is the most unrealistic part of this entire episode, and Zon gets arrested. Which wraps everything in a nice little bow. Don't mind all the therapy Fauna is going to need that she's not going to get. And as the gang says goodbye to everyone, Pete gives Fauna a little kiss on the cheek, because it's Planet of the Apes, and that's just expected at this point. I hate this episode. I don't know why Pete had to be the one to get involved in a cross-species romance. The other two at least have romances with their own species, even if those aren't exactly ideal. But there is one thing I actually like about this episode. There's a cop in this episode named Perdix, and I like him because he actually has honor. Like most apes, he doesn't care about humans, but that doesn't stop him from wanting to do things by the book and being against the lynch mob. And I really appreciate that. This show actually does a good job of having characters that aren't necessarily evil, but are just racist because they're uneducated and live in a society that constantly hammers in the idea that humans are inferior and awful. And I think that's really cool. You still have the cartoonishly evil racists like Zahn, but a lot of apes and even humans in this world are just victims of their upbringing. Even Galen himself was, and even throughout the show still is a little bit, one of those apes. He believed that humans are inferior, but unlike the rest of the apes we see in the show, Galen is like 5 seconds away from throwing everything he never knew away. Okay, that might be a little inaccurate, but he does seem way more interested in the idea of intelligent humans than anyone around. So, when he finds the book Pete and Alan had that made them realize they were in the future and starts reading it, he doesn't necessarily believe it, but it does make him think. And, unlike Zaius, who already knew this, it does change his mind about whether society is correct to treat humans as they do. And maybe humans and apes should treat each other as equals. Now, of course, these ideas of humans previously being superior and equality between humans and apes doesn't go over well with Zaius, who calls it heresy. So Galen goes and asks a human what it's like being a human, which is hilarious because obviously the guy does not know how to respond to that. And obviously Zaius yelling at Galen for being curious wasn't going to help things because all it does is prove to Galen that the book he read was right. But when Pete and Alan ask him for help to escape prison, partially because they don't want to be in prison and partially because they want to talk to Zaius and see what he can tell them about the astronauts that came before them, he still doesn't want to commit crimes for some strange reason. He does end up committing a little crime, and by little crime I mean murder. Well, okay, technically it's closer to manslaughter because it is an accident. See, Galen goes back to the pair later that night to talk to them again about the book, and unfortunately he finds them in the middle of a staged escape attempt. See, while Galen was having his existential crisis, Urko and Zaius were arguing about whether to keep Pete and Alan alive. Zaius wanted to keep them alive to interrogate them so he could have a better idea about what to do if people like them showed up again, and Urko just wants them dead, so they don't spread their dangerous ideas of equality and human intelligence. So even though he couldn't legally kill them, he could stage a reason to kill them, which is what he did. Urko had told one of his guards to leave the door to the cell unlocked and to let them leave, only to shoot them in the escape, giving an excuse for their deaths. Pete and Alan aren't stupid, however, and immediately know this is a trap, but also know this is probably their best chance at getting out. And technically, they're right. But it's only because Galen sees the guard about to shoot them and warns them, letting the pair escape, but causing Galen and the guard to fight, and Galen accidentally shooting the guard with his own gun. Somehow this isn't the worst crime he's committed, as it turns out that owning the book he was reading is punishable by death, probably because it's heresy. Galen, of course, was just trying to figure out the truth, but as is in the first movie, truth is not allowed around here. Which of course leaves it to Pete and Alan to free him, much to the confusion of Zaius, who thinks they should just escape. Which is pretty much the end of the episode, leaving Galen forced to leave his friends and family behind because he thought too much. He'll see some of his friends and family as the series goes on anyway, but for now he doesn't realize that. Galen is a very useful member of the group. Because he's from the time, he knows a bit more about the culture, and because he's an ape, he will actually be listened to by other apes, and, if need be, he can pretend that Pete and Alan are his servants, allowing them to travel a bit more freely. Sure, Galen pretending he owns Pete and Alan only works about half the time, but that's better than nothing. But Galen also has a second benefit. He's an aristocrat with a father that's apparently friends with Zaius and eventually becomes part of the council himself, and family members all across the government, mostly prefects who are usually in charge of entire towns or areas. This really only comes into play twice. The first is when we actually meet Galen's parents. It's in the same episode where Pete gets interrogated by the flirtatious Wanda, and as the way that Alan and Galen free him is with the help of Galen's parents, An and Yelu. Galen's mother is of course a lot more willing to help than his father, and she helps them get into the hospital Pete is brought into so he can be lobotomized, doing her part as the pushy wife of a government leader who won't take no for an answer. Yelu, on the other hand, is pretty against the fact that his son is a wanted criminal who fraternizes with humans, despite the fact that he doesn't turn Galen and Alan in. But Yelu, like Perdix, understands honor. So by the end of the episode, he still doesn't like humans, but he is proud of Galen for sticking to his principles and being kind and loving, and helps Galen hide from the authorities when they search his home. So it's progress and a pretty sweet moment. The only other two mentions of Galen's family are in the pilot, where the prefect of the area where Pete and Alan's ship is found is Galen's second cousin on his mother's side, and episode 11, The Tyrant, where the prefect is his cousin and is immediately removed from office because his underling is a corrupt, tyrant who usurps him. So it's not relevant often, but it does give a consistent idea that Galen's family is pretty powerful, which makes the plot of the final episode, Up Against the World So High, that much stranger. Galen has two episodes where his love life is the focus, one where he convinces his ex, a doctor, to save Alan's life, and this episode, where he falls in love with the antagonist of the episode, a chimpanzee named Cassia. Cassia is the worst, and Galen mostly seems to fall for her because the plot needed some sense of betrayal, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The episode revolves around a human named Lurik who wants to fly but gets captured by the apes. He would have been killed if not for the fact that Cassia manages to convince the High Council to use him to figure out flight, something that was lost to time, but they know the ancestors, who of course they don't realize were actually humans, knew how to do. Cassia is not doing this out of the goodness of her heart, and indeed doesn't care about Lurik at all, but instead wants flight for her own nefarious purposes, specifically to fly over Urko's barracks and the High Council and bomb them to kill Urko and the High Council. She's a violent revolutionary, and while there's definitely a lot of reasons to have a revolution, so much so that in the previous episode, the happy ending is a group of humans saying they're going to band together to fight the apes, Cassia's reason is explicitly racism and a sense of superiority against all other species of apes. Indeed, she even has a book, which she gets Galen to also read, that apparently proves that chimpanzees are the superior species. Galen calls the book flattering, but Cassia seems to be using it as an excuse for her revolution. Her other reason is provably false. See, Cassia claims that only orangutans and gorillas are the ones with any power, and her proof is that only those species are the ones in the High Council. Now, ignoring the fact that only chimpanzees are prefects, which is definitely a position of power, we also see in multiple episodes that there are, in fact, chimpanzees in the High Council. Of course, this episode doesn't show that, despite showing the High Council, but other episodes do, and we never see a wide shot of the council in this episode, as the shots carefully avoid where the chimpanzees would normally sit. And, in case you forgot, Galen's father is part of the council. Now, I don't know if the council is the same thing as the High Council, but either way, it's still a pretty big position of power. Now, I don't know how much of this is intentionally wrong. Cassia is manipulative, pulling the classic thanking someone for something they didn't agree to do it so that they agree to do it, is racist and violent, wanting to bomb apes with frag bombs, so her being objectively wrong could be part of the point. But the fact that we don't see chimpanzees in the High Council in this episode specifically makes me think that the writers just didn't think very hard about it. Though her argument does bring up a good point about how the apes are segregated by job. This is not something unique to this show, as the previous movies and even the original book also had this, but the show does seem to bring it up a decent amount. Here's what I mean. In the entirety of the 14 episodes of Planet of the Apes, there is not a single gorilla that isn't in the military. We also only ever see 4 orangutans, 3 of whom are in the High Council, and the 4th still being a government leader. Every other single ape we see is a chimpanzee. Now, of course, this could be a coincidence, as most of the apes we see are either the military or the High Council, and especially since we see so few orangutans, and there definitely have to be more than 2 orangutans in the entire country. country, but what definitely isn't a coincidence is when Galen's cousin gets forcibly removed from office, Galen is baffled, saying,
"Our kind always fills administrative spots, not gorillas."
Which to me indicates that Cassia is partially correct, in that certain positions are intentionally filled by certain species of ape. And there is definitely racism between apes, a problem that even Galen isn't innocent of. Though Galen, despite thinking humans deserve equal rights, still think humans are the dumb and weaker species, despite being proven time and time again that the humans he's with are smarter than most apes, and for some reason at least as strong as gorillas, as we see them knock out plenty in one-on-one fights. But back to Cassia trying to kill all the government leaders. When the gang finds out about this, partially from Cassia straight up telling Galen, thinking that he'd join her, they decide they need to stop her. And after a failed attempt to destroy the glider, they instead decide that Lurik and Galen will trick Cassia and the lieutenant to force them to test the glider, and they will fly it into the sea, destroying it forever and causing everyone to assume Galen, or an ape named Protus as he was pretending to be, and Lurik have died at sea too. And this is touted as a success, but Cassia is still free. Her evil plan was not revealed, and she still has the bomb, which means she could easily try again in a different way if the show continued. Indeed, considering the previous episode did end with the start of a massive human revolution, if this show had continued and wasn't episodic, there could have been some very interesting consequences in the future. We were talking about Galen, weren't we? Well, Galen also has one more trait that I think can be attributed to him being an aristocrat, though maybe he's just sane, and it puts him at odds with our final main character, Alan. See, Alan is the heroic one of the group, and while Pete will often join him and sometimes is first to help, Alan usually seems to be the one that actively wants to go out of their way to help someone, with Pete usually quickly agreeing. Galen, on the other hand, is, well, some may call it selfish, I would call it more practical about the whole thing. They're criminals on the run, so Galen's chief goal is to not get killed, or at least not get captured, both of which are a lot more likely when the gang decides to stick out their neck to solve someone else's problem. And indeed, he's right. Usually the episodes that start with the gang going out of their way to help someone end with them just barely avoiding capture, or in some cases needing to escape after being captured. This all really comes to a head in episode 12, The Cure, where Alan wants to go help a town infected with malaria, and Galen calls him out on it, saying he keeps getting the gang into trouble. This isn't resolved, because how could it be? And of course it's not mentioned again, because this show has barely any continuity between episodes, but Galen consistently being annoyed at Pete and Alan for this is interesting, because it provides some decent contrast between the humans and the sane person. Alan is also interesting because he had a wife and son before he got thrown into ape times. It's one of the two things we know about his life before time travel, or LBTT as I like to call it, the other being that he grew up on a farm. The farm thing somehow does manage to be relevant, as it means he's able to help a family of farmers farm better, and apparently it also means that he's really good at riding horses quickly. Him being a family man matters a lot more to his character though, partially because he can work well with kids, and partially because it means he has something he really wants to get back to. This is not necessarily a good thing. I think it's good from a character standpoint that Alan had people that he loved and will never be able to get back to. I think dealing with that could have been interesting, especially with the idea that while yes, his wife and son died, they probably lived full lives before doing so. It wasn't like their lives were cut short. From their point of view, Alan is the one who was cruelly taken away from them before his time. That could have been really interesting to explore. The problem, of course, is that that's not what's happening. This is technically a story about Pete and Alan trying to get home, so it's not that Alan had a wife and kid, he still says he has a wife and kid, which makes this scene pretty weird. Now, admittedly, this is kind of a pity kiss, similar to Pete kissing Fauna, except this time they're both humans, so I guess it's less weird. The girl's name is Amy, and yes, it's another story where someone falls in love way too fast, and just like with Fauna, it's pointed out that it was way too fast. However, there are a few differences. Amy falling in love with Alan actually happens before the episode even starts, and Alan has to convince her in the only flashback in the entire show not to come with them when they leave. He does a terrible job. His first argument is that he's married, though of course Amy doesn't really believe this. His second argument is not that he's a criminal on the run and it would be a really bad idea to make her also a criminal, and needing to keep her safe would slow them down. Instead, he tells her he's from the past, which is not a good argument, and also not something he should be telling a random girl he barely knows, because random people knowing who he is bound to cause problems for that gang. And shocker, it does. Indeed, this episode is the cure, and Alan doing this is what causes Galen to go off on him for being stupid. Galen is proved right when Amy, delirious with malaria, starts talking in her sleep about how Alan is from another world, right within earshot of the doctor that's taken charge of the town. And the doctor's not completely stupid. He knows about the trio, even if he doesn't know what they look like, and it's not helped by the fact that Alan and Pete are a little too knowledgeable about how to cure malaria to be normal humans of the time, and also, Galen's name is Galen. The only reason they don't get captured is because the trio manages to convince the doctor that if he turns them into Zaius, the rest of the High Council will find out he didn't actually do anything to cure the malaria, and it was all Pete and Alan. Most of this episode involves the gang trying to cure malaria in time while also avoiding Urko, so this is really just a minor plot point in a larger story, but Alan is still being an idiot. And when it's time to say goodbye to Amy, a girl that previously said that any man she would meet she would compare to Alan kissing her goodbye is not going to help her get over him. But also, Alan, you say you're married. You're not actually, your wife has long since died, but considering even in this episode you still say you're married, you're being pretty weird. Despite all this, Alan is still the nicest character of the three, and the other woman that falls for him is more inspired by his kindness to think that maybe the world isn't all that bad and doesn't beg him to stay. I guess I should also talk about that episode. It's The Legacy, the same episode where the gang finds the hologram. In the middle of the episode, Alan gets captured, and Zaius decides that instead of a normal interrogation, he's going to capture a woman named Arn and a kid named Crick, and stick the three in the ruins of that oil baron's castle I mentioned earlier in the video. The idea is that because Alan had a wife and son, he'd subconsciously treat Arn and Crick like his family, trusting them enough to tell them where Pete and Galen are. Crick was promised food to rat out Alan, and since he's a homeless orphan, yeah, that would be a pretty good deal for him. Crick's a brat, but he's the kind of brat you'd expect from a homeless orphan child, i.e. he's a thief and proud of it, and is generally extremely selfish. And this plan of Zaius's does work because of it. And also because Alan does kind of start treating Arn and Crick like a wife and son, and ends up trusting the pair enough to tell them where Pete and Galen are. Luckily, Alan was being such a father to Crick that I guess he felt remorse, because he does tell Alan he did this and help him and Arn escape. Arn, on the other hand, is just the widow of a revolutionary leader, no big deal. This little fact, which adds very little to the plot, but was put in for some reason anyway, is fascinating to me, because the main reason Zaius and Urko want to capture Pete and Alan is because they might spread dangerous ideas like humans having rights. But clearly, they aren't the only ones, and normal humans of the time also do that sometimes. Episode 13, The Liberator, has a guy who would have started a much more violent revolution than the one that is implied to be about to happen at the end of that episode, so it's not like Pete and Alan are the ones inciting the revolution either. The real issue, probably, is that with Pete and Alan's help, a revolution might actually succeed, because they're much smarter than everyone around them. So, yes, Alan is a little too open, especially with women that like him, but he's just such a good guy that it doesn't even matter and he still ends up winning. I don't mind Alan, but he is definitely the one that causes the most problems of the group. That's the three main characters taken care of, but I do feel it's necessary to talk about Zaius and Urko. Zaius is probably one of the most consistent character names across the entire franchise, so I find it interesting to do a comparison with him across the different continuities, as he's technically a different version of the same character in each one, though of course he's interpreted very differently each time. Here, he's a much worse rehash of the Zaius of the original movie. The thing about this Zaius is that he technically has the same goals of hiding the truth of humans from everyone as the Zaius of the original movie, but he's a lot meaner about it. The original movie Zaius was manipulative and conniving, but especially in the second movie, he seemed willing to work with people, like Zira and Cornelius, and you could believe that his main goal was the protection of his people. The show Zaius seems more focused on making humans stay oppressed, while claiming it's for the protection of his people. This isn't necessarily a bad change, but it just makes him a very different character. What makes him not as good of a character is the fact that he's just worse at accomplishing his goals. There's a good reason for this, technically. This is a TV show. Zaius can't completely succeed because then the heroes lose and there's no more show. But he also can't completely fail and the heroes completely escape because then one of the main antagonists of the show would just not be an antagonist. The thing is, Urko should have that same problem, but he doesn't seem nearly as incompetent as Zaius, so what's the deal with that? Well, I think part of it comes from the fact that Zaius says his goal is to capture Pete and Alan and learn from them in case more of them come, but he doesn't seem to know what that means. In the episode where Pete is captured, his interrogation is bad because the questions being asked are just not questions that will help Zaius figure anything out. We get two questions. One of them is, who has helped you? And the other is, tell me everything. One of those is useful in figuring out who else to capture maybe, but the other is so vague it might as well be useless. Admittedly, when Zaius has a scheme for getting Alan to provide information, it actually works, but mostly what Zaius seems to be there to do is delay the actions of the real antagonist of the show, Urko. Now, Urko does need to be delayed, even from the Apes' perspective, because he can be a little trigger-happy, and while it's usually towards humans, that doesn't mean he's very kind to apes either. The apes are cheap. There's an entire episode dedicated to Urko scamming apes out of land with rigged horse race betting, bets that the apes he makes these bets with know he's going to win, but for some reason still make the bet with him. I would assume because they feel like they have to. He technically has to listen to the High Council, but boy does he barely. In the malaria episode, he's ready to burn down the entire town, and while technically the council gave him permission to do so, they make him wait to see if the cure would work, and boy does he not wait. That episode also has him refuse to give his dying soldier an experimental cure because
you will not experiment with my troops.
Bro, he's going to die anyways. Give it a chance at least. Though, side note, this is not the only time people have an issue with an experimental thing on a dying person. There's an episode where someone is ostracized because she gave blood to her dying brother by the request of the doctors, and the brother died from the blood transfusion. The doctors decided blood transfusions were a bad idea, but her own father decided her blood was evil and said she killed her brother. Again, he was dying anyways. She didn't really do anything. Urko is actually such a problem that Zaius threatens to remove him from command multiple times, but of course never does because this show can't have lasting consequences. He is constantly trying to make up excuses to kill Pete and Alan, but also other humans as well, usually in some kind of oh, they tried to escape, so I had to shoot them way. Urko is generally a menace to both humans and apes, and this makes him a pretty good antagonist to the gang, who are mostly just trying to survive and be helpful. But it also makes some episodes a little odd. Episode 11, The Tyrant, has the antagonist of the episode, a gorilla named Oboro, buying his power by taking too much grain from the humans, selling that grain, and then giving that money to Urko's assistant Bolta so they'll put him in power. Now, despite everything we've seen, apparently Urko isn't fond of corruption, as Oboro says. He even arrests Oboro, though admittedly by that point Oboro has tried to kill Urko. Though, speaking of Oboro trying to kill Urko, despite Urko being a menace to society, our main characters still try to save his life multiple times, which may seem odd, but usually the person trying to kill Urko is way worse than him, like Cassia. And in the case of Oboro, it's almost their fault. In an attempt to get Oboro caught for corruption, they convince him that Galen is Zaius' assistant and that Zaius wants Oboro to replace Urko. Oboro decides the best way to get rid of Urko is to kill him, which was not the point, and if Urko was killed, who would be there to stop Oboro? But I do love a good the heroes and villains have to work together episode, so I'm glad there's a couple of those in there. There's even an episode where Pete and Urko have to work together to escape a pit, and Alan and Galen have to work with Urko's underlings to help them out. It makes for good dynamics, and may be the best episode of the show. Yeah, that's all I have to say. I could absolutely say more, as I barely talked about Barlow, who proves that being pro-human doesn't mean not being a lying weasel, or the episode where the gang stops a human from doing chemical warfare, but this video is about as long as an episode, which I think is long enough. I don't like this show. I think most of the characters are really good, even the one-off ones, but they don't do enough with them. I think the world is interesting, but it's contradictory and doesn't make any sense. I think the plots are pretty boring. They mostly involve the gang teaching someone about stuff like how to farm better and blood types, and the general premise could use a lot of work. All in all, this is a show that exists.
We can't go home, Alan. We're on Earth. We're there already.